Mediterranean in September and October, and we came back and we didn't get anything.
Good for you.
Wow. Well, good
Yeah.
evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And we are delighted to have our good friend Charles Todd here with us. He's going to be talking about the brand new Bess Crawford novel called The Cliff's Edge. And just, I think today, we got our autographed copies. There we go. And I will go ahead and put a link in the comments field on YouTube and Facebook, should you wish to purchase a signed copy. And if you have questions for Charles, go ahead and type them in, and Barbara will bring me back on screen towards the end of the hour, and I'd be happy to ask any questions you might have. So, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. So I will hold up the book, which I think has a really evocative cover. This is the 13th in the Bess Crawford series.
Yes, it is.
She's passed through the war, where her role was as a nurse over in the battlefront. There I went and touched my face, just the way we were talking about. And inevitably, Bess has to think about what her life is going to be, because it was filled with purpose during the war years. And what does that mean now? But before we do that, Charles, how has this been for you, talking about this book without your mom?
It took a while. But A Game of Fear had to be copy edited and then proofed for publication. And then Caroline and I turned in a rough draft in July. She passed in August of 2021. And so there was a lot of work involved getting it accepted by the publisher and going through all the various machinations you go through before it actually is a book on the shelf. And yet it was oddly good, because I was busy, and I was busy doing something that was very important to both of us. So it had its rough moments, but it's amazing when you have deadlines and certain things that have to be done, you have to bear down and get it done. And I knew that would have been important to her. So I jumped right in and did my best. And now this week, I'm hoping to turn the manuscript in for the next Rutledge.
Wonderful. But do you know the last event that you and your mom and I did together, which was in July, and it was for Bess, and then she died the next month. So,
Yes.
you know, and she was so cute. She always had a certain amount of trouble working out Zoom in the house, you know, either the
Yes.
lighting or the sound or whatever it was. It was always kind of challenging. I mean, she was here at the bookstore so many times, and I was thinking, I don't think you were no, I know you weren't with her. She came out the year that the Desert Botanical Garden had its first.
Yes, she thoroughly enjoyed that.
Well, she loved it so much while we were there, because the event started at 7 and the sunset was coming. And it was, I think, towards late February. And she said to me, "Do we have to be on time for the event?" And I said, "No." I said, "You know, we could stay until the sun sets and really admire this." So I called the store and I said, "Tell everybody to hang on. We'll be there after a while." So we got there, I guess, about 25 minutes late. People were sitting kindly in their seats. And your mom waxed on about how wonderful the exhibit was and all. She had such a good time. She was always curious. You know, that's one of the things I loved about Carolyn. She was always curious and wanted to be pleased. She was never, you know, sour or cranky. She really just wanted to be pleased.
That characteristic and her strong belief in paying it forward.
Mhm.
There are countless times we've been at conventions. I used to pick on Caroline because I'd go walking down the hall and here she is sitting in a chair with all these young ladies sitting around listening to every word she has to say. And I'm like, come on, Mom, can't you share a little? But it thrilled her when she could spend some time with young authors who were trying to break into the business and help them any way she could. And that and her, she was a Southerner. There's no question about it.
Now, that's absolutely true. She was very generous to other authors, even when I was still editing and publishing books. 2 or 3 times she, was kind enough to read one of the books and give it a quote. And also, it's really, there's a big hole without Carolyn. But I also was thinking when I read this that, inevitably Bess has to come to some resolution about her personal life and her professional life. And I sense a movement in this book. I don't want to spoil anything for anybody, but I think that she's poised to have to make a couple of discoveries and decisions. Would that be a fair statement?
I think you're absolutely correct. Do we face that with Rutledge after Game of Fear
Mm-hmm.
and with his new role? And now I was saying to my agent, Lisa Gallagher, that I think of the two, Bess is going to be the most difficult for me to try to reproduce, because even though we worked so hard on it together, her unique intuition really came out in the voice of Bess Crawford. And yet she is in a pickle right now.
Yeah, she is. Well, your mom had a background in romance writing, and I think that's one reason that the characters in both your series have always been so alive. And you do have to move them forward. Rutledge couldn't stay forever in his position at the Yard, and Bess, it was really hard for women after the First World War, because for many women, that was the first time they ever had like a real job, where they were away from their parent or husband or whoever's supervision and doing work. And it happened after the Second World War too. If you talk to some of the people, for example, the women who worked at Bletchley, and it happened in this country, when the war was over and men came home, and there were women who were doing useful work, and suddenly it wasn't available. So Bess has resigned from Queen Alexandra's nursing, hasn't she? Do I have that right?
She did that in An Irish Hostage.
Right, which was the one before this, the one that
Correct.
you, Mom, and I talked about in July of 2021. So that was a first step towards, what was she going to do with her life? She could have just gone home and lived with her parents for a while, waited for a suitor to come along, whatever. So did you and your mom really talk about what was going to happen to Bess, or was it kind of organic as you were moving along?
It was a little bit of both. We would talk in general terms about the fact that we were getting to a place in Bess's life where some things were going to have to naturally progress after the war was over. And in many ways, the cliff's edge was after An Irish Hostage and the situation with Simon. Bess was in a position where Simon was not having anything to do with anybody. He pretty much closed himself up in his cottage and was not around very much. And naturally, that was driving Bess up a wall. And so when Melinda came along with an opportunity to go to York, she was hoping to go there anyway to see a friend. But Melinda, right.
Yeah.
Melinda was a friend of Lillian, who was the companion to Lady Beatrice. Ostensibly, the correspondence from Melinda was, you go up there, you convince her she really needs a quality nurse there with her in the home after her gallbladder surgery. And then you stop by and see your friend and come home. Sounds simple, not even enough to write a book about. But when Bess arrives in, actually, Lady Beatrice lived about 30 miles northwest of York. When Bess arrives, Lady Beatrice is just absolutely inconsolable. She wants Bess to be that nurse. And I think we all know those kinds of people that once they have their mindset on something, and especially someone from Lady Beatrice's background, who's pretty much accustomed to dictating terms, she decides that Bess will do just nicely, thank you, and she can stay and take care of her when she gets through her surgery. And Bess was a little taken aback by all this. And so finally she realizes that she's been outfoxed, so to speak, and says, all right, I'll make the best of it. But, you know, first opportunity, I'm heading back to Somerset and going back about my business. And everything goes according to plan. Lady Beatrice goes in, has her operation. Bess goes and sees her friend in York, and they're putting things together, making ready for her to be released from the hospital, when suddenly they get a call that Gordon Neville, her great nephew, had fallen off the edge of a cliff.
Right.
And
Let's stop right there because we don't want to go too far here. But
no, we don't.
no, but there are a whole lot of things.
And things get really complicated from there.
They really do. There's so many things to talk about in what Charles has just been saying. For one thing, we could talk about landscape. One of the things I've always loved about the Rutledge and the Best series is how much the landscape, whether it's the village or whatever it might be, is an essential part of the book. It's almost like a character. Certainly in the Rutledges, you've taken us on a tour all around England, and you know every Rutledge has a particular, very strong background. And this one, it's York, and it's not just Yorkshire as a culture and all, but the actual geography, the fact that it has crumbling rock, plays a role.
The fells in York are not as tall as the ones in the Lake District, but they're very unique in that they are shaped very differently. They're not your standard mountaintop. And as a result, they actually have different names for the different mountains that make up what they call in England the fells. And that whole concept of the small rivers, the farming land, the sheep, the dealing with the outcroppings and everything, and climbing up to places so that you could look out and see where your sheep are, plays a critical role in defining the book, because not only are you sort of captured in that house, but you're captured by or held captive by the landscape.
Well, you are. Not only that, because of the nature of these rock promontories and all, it's hard to decide whether somebody fell by accident or whether somebody was in fact pushed. I mean, you get cliffside settings in a lot of British fiction, and you're never sure, did the guy go over the cliff? Did he throw himself over the cliff? Did the cliff crumble away? Did somebody give him a shove? And, you can replicate. I've spent a lot of time in Yorkshire. I've actually chased sheep in Yorkshire and driven. There are a lot of really tiny roads. in Yorkshire.
Yes, there are.
Which I have driven. And, you know, it's a very different part of England than Somerset, that's for sure. But I love the fact that that's an important part of the best book. But the other thing I thought you really brought out, Charles, I mean, we are not 2 decades or barely 2 decades into aspirin being commercially available as a medicine. And, you know, Lady Beatrice is having today, you would check into the hospital probably at 7 a.m. They would take out your gallbladder and you'd be home. You'd be home
Yes.
for tea. And, you know, this is a production. This is Lady Beatrice, you know, has to go and stay in the hospital. There's all these ahead of time. She has to have careful. She does have I think, a heart issue. Isn't that part of it?
Yes.
Right. So, you know, she's more delicate. But nonetheless, there is this, you know, whole like 2-week or something arc involved in this gallbladder surgery, you know. But also, as we read through the book, we realize how little there really is.
There was practically a caravan moving her.
Well, there was, but you know, but you're thinking about what Best can actually offer her and other people, and thinking about the state of medicine, there wasn't a whole lot available in modern terms. I mean, you know, just keeping wounds sanitized, pain control, you know, all the rest of it.
We were traveling from Trieste back to Venice and stopped at the battlefield between the Austro-Hungarians who were up on the hill and the Italians, and they had covered trenches. So they had pretty well survived a lot of the wear and tear. But also at that site, they had a medical museum. And the thing that struck me going through that museum was the fact that so many of the instruments hadn't changed from the instruments that they were using in the American Civil War.
Yeah.
If you look at a doctor's kit or a nurse's kit, but primarily the doctor's kit and the different implements that they used, they were not that different. And there were all kinds of gruesome operations being done, and a lot of them were done with no anesthesia, no pain medication, no.
Well, that's right. They actually had saws, because one of the only
Yes.
things you could do for gangrene was basically to cut off the limb and hope that it hadn't, you know, moved any farther. So,
Well, and the other problem was a lot of times when you see World War II movies or World War I movies, you see these people laying on the ground and the machine gun sitting there. Well, there's a reason for that. They were aiming for the legs.
yeah. Right. So
And
we couldn't move.
one soldier gets injured, it takes 2 soldiers to drag him back.
Yeah.
And it was done intentionally so they could sweep the ground and wound the legs. And so a lot of the amputations that came out of that particular aspect of the war were phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, I just think, you know, you have to get yourself to realize it's only been a century essentially since this book took place, with a couple of years more. But that kind of surgery today that Lady Beatrice is going to have, you know, would be almost a non-event. And, you know, is this huge production in the book. And I think, you know, you have to accept that, and you have to recognize how far medicine has come in such a short time. And I mean, the Victorians, we know, you know, actually had access to a lot of drugs. I mean, they could swill laudanum and, you know, Thomas de Quincey, the opium eater. I mean, you could buy drugs for teething children. You know, I think they used to rub, you know, some sort of opium or gin or something on teething children's gums to keep them from crying. It was kind of a step forward from, in the 18th century, the primary anesthesia was alcohol.
Right.
And then in the 19th century, you know, because of India, Afghanistan, all the rest of it,
Correct.
they learned about opium. And
Because
so,
the old trick with the children was you basically took whiskey and rubbed it on their
oh, was it
gums
whiskey?
when they were
Okay.
teething.
Right. So, you know, but it's interesting that Bess never seems to have much in the way of opium available. You know, she has aspirin.
Well, primarily in this particular venue, she doesn't have the kind of access that a doctor would necessarily have access to, number one. And number two, someone like her would not be permitted to deal in those types of medications. When she was in the hospital, fine, but
Right.
just a former combat field nurse being said, well, here, have some opium in case you need it. You know?
Right, just, pack it up, carry it along. Well, anyway, as you know, it's really interesting, you know, to see, and Lady Beatrice indeed is one of those kind of amazingly powerful women. I mean, she's an aristocrat. She's used to people doing as she wishes. And instead of ordering people about, she just kind of flows right over them. I mean, you know, she's invincibly
Yes.
polite and, you know, all the rest. And Bess can't find any way to withstand that. You know, if Lady Beatrice had really been ugly to her or, you know, whatever, Bess maybe could have pushed back, but it's nearly impossible to.
Well, suddenly there's a dressmaker there making dresses for her.
Yeah, I mean, she didn't bring enough clothes, you know, to stay. So Lady Beatrice rules with an iron rod, but also kindness and generosity. And so there we are. Anyhow, eventually they move on to a smaller village because Lady Beatrice,
Scarfdale.
right, godson, if I remember this right, is involved. The family of her
Yes.
godson is where a death has occurred. And then we aren't going to be able to tell you a whole lot more about that, except that we are mired in we're one of those sort of closed circle things, the Agatha Christie thing, where
Just barely under the surface, there had been some disagreement and bad blood.
Yeah.
Between the Caldwells and the Nevilles, but they kind of glossed over it in a way. And suddenly the situation on the cliff made that entire situation boil up to the surface.
Yeah.
And as a result, people are separating into various camps, and we're just thanking the good Lord that there were enough rooms in that house.
well, you know, that's it. I mean, everybody was forced to stay together, whether, you know, when feelings were running high, it wasn't like they could turn across the street to the Marriott or something and check in
Well,
there.
and the core was, it was Mrs. Neville's birthday, and everybody was coming in from hither and yon to pay their respects and attend her birthday party. It wasn't just that they happened to show up.
Right.
They
No,
were
that's true.
they
It was
were
a-
intentionally invited in to take part in this celebration for Mrs. Neville. And unfortunately, that forced the issue to come to the surface. But that's why you had the two different camps suddenly in the same house. And then Inspector Wade didn't want anybody going anywhere until he sorted everything out the way he thought it should be.
Yeah, and there's some very long-standing simmering resentments or relationships that you know, it all kind of comes to the surface in a cauldron like that. So anyway, it's a very interesting story, and we're not going to be able to tell you how it comes out. But Bess, it is a
They
result of
can
all
find
this.
out when they buy the book and read it.
That's right. And remember, we have autographed copies right here. But at the end of it, there's Bess. I mean, she does survive it. She herself is not, you know, the immediate target of a killer or whatever. And she still has to figure out what she's going to do next. So one of my questions is, are you in fact going to be able to write another Bess and tell us are we all going to wonder forever what happens?
My first obligation was to write an Ian Rutledge book. And as I said, it will be turned in this week to my agent. Who knows? They could say to me, oh, it's not the same. It's no good. How
I
did you
don't think
get
they'll
your
go
name
that
on this
far.
book? And that would pretty much decide what goes on from there. In the meantime, while they're doing all that, as soon as I get this book and I have a short story that's due in March, and then I'm going to begin to tackle Bess. Not literally, but
No, I know what you mean, but I think your readers deserve, a final book, if it's only one more, with some sort of, we followed Beth faithfully. And I would be personally really disappointed not to have, some sort of conclusion to her
well,
journey.
there's so much involved here. Bess is at a fork in the road, so to speak. Bess and Simon are at a fork in the road. I'm not so much interested in trying to take a book and end it happily ever after and they ride off into the sunset. But I am very interested in attempting to explore where she takes her career next and the decisions that she makes. And a lot of that will be influenced by things that happen in the future. And so I'm more interested in actually tackling those issues and carrying on in another book. If they say, all right, that's acceptable, then, at some point in time, let's put it this way. I'm not going to stop writing, and I am definitely not going to leave Bess in the lurch.
I wasn't thinking of her in the lurch, and I wasn't even thinking about her personal life so much as, she was so dedicated to nursing and, learned so much and came so far. I don't really want to see her just retiring home to Somerset to do the odd gardening and, have an
Can
occasional.
you really see Bess retiring to
No,
Somerset and
no,
gardening?
I do not. And also her parents have never been that sort, and they too, their lives have changed. Her father, who has been a professional army man for, as we know, because of your earlier story, I think it was the novella where we went back to India?
Yes, the Hanging at Dawn.
That's right. Yep. And so we learned about Bess's father. We learned about Simon as a young, as a boy, the whole bit. And so
that was a fascinating book. I don't mean to digress, but to each chapter in the book is written by a different character in the book.
Right.
And that was a lot of fun.
It's a wonderful story too. I got hooked years and years ago on the Far Pavilions, although I think that MMK should have made it 2 books. I mean, it didn't need to be an 1,100 page wonder. It needed to go to a certain point, and then the whole Afghan story, should have been, I've always thought, a separate book. But nonetheless, if you read it, you really learned a lot about, or at least her version of things that went on in British India under the Raj and up in that country and all. And so I love the fact that you revisited it in The Hanging Tree.
Caroline always had a love for India, and I am so happy that she was able to go and spend time in India. When she graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, she was supposed to go to India to teach English.
Hmm.
And because at that time, this was the middle 50s, they were having the language riots in India, and her trip to India was canceled. And yet my mother always dreamed of going to India. Then, of course, my mother always dreamed of going to a lot of places, and by golly, she made her way to a lot of them.
She did. She was a tremendous traveler. I mean, you spent every year you went to England up until COVID, but you also went to a lot of other places as well.
Yes, and Deanna and I went back to England this year. We spent our time in Kent, Sussex, and then we went down all the way to Brighton, which was wonderful to see. Got to spend some time in George IV,
right, the Royal Pavilion.
the Royal Pavilion.
Right.
That says India, doesn't it?
Well, the Royal Pavilion, I've spent a lot of time in the Royal Pavilion. I can talk to you about the chef in the kitchen and caramel, and I can talk to you about what is it? It looks as though something popped and went out to sea. I can't remember. I mean, there's a lot of wonderful stuff about Brighton, but I'm almost
Queen Victoria did not like that place at all.
No, she didn't. But, I'm a walking Bible at Regency. So, I cut my teeth on Georgette Hair and whatever. And I'm finding it really interesting to see how Bridgerton has taken the Regency and stretched it. I mean, it's completely unrealistic, but at the same time, very interesting.
Bridgerton is very entertaining, and it took some liberties, but it was sort of what if.
Yeah.
And so for that purpose, I was absolutely
there
fascinated by it.
Right.
Huh?
I was there for the clothes. I thought that
right.
they were absolutely fabulous. And of course they did it in Dublin because there isn't enough Georgian architecture available in England. So they filmed it in Dublin. But I mean, the architecture, the interior decoration of the rooms, one of the best Regency rooms I've ever been in is in a palace in St. Petersburg, directly behind the Grand Hotel. I can't remember the name of it. But there was a huge fashion for Egyptian furniture and other stuff as a result of Napoleon. And it really is this beautifully preserved Regency room. And I thought, wow, I've just walked into a Georgette Hair novel right here in St. Petersburg, Russia.
You're thinking of Peterhof.
No, not one of those. It's actually in St. Petersburg. It's not in the Hofs.
The Winter Palace, Catherine the Great's Winter Palace is in Leningrad.
Well, they're outside St. Petersburg. They were destroyed in the war because they were on the other side, so to speak. This is right. I'd have to look it up, but it's right in the heart of St. Petersburg, and it is a palace. I mean, it was literally right behind the Grand Hotel. You have to drive a long way to get to the Pavelhof and the Peterhof and
yes, definitely.
But no. This was in the city. But
Catherine the Great's palace was right there on the river. In fact, the battleship Potemkin was right outside our hotel. We stayed right on the river.
Wow, that's wonderful. I mean, I think St. Petersburg is a gorgeous city. Rob and I spent an entire, I think it was 8 days there as friends of the Hermitage. So we got to go to the museum every day and spend the day there doing all kinds of neat things. Before, we had been there in the summer where we attempted to visit the Japanese tourists, they operate in what you would call a crocodile, right? You can't penetrate a Japanese tourist crocodile. I mean, if they're there, you're toast. So Rob and I went to the Catherine Hof and just abandoned hope of ever going inside, and instead spent all our time in the gardens, which were absolutely beautiful. And that was one reason I said when we had a chance to go and spend a week in December, I picked December instead of October at the Catherine Hof. There was nobody there. And so we had a
That's,
chance to go in and they opened up rooms and, it was wonderful.
we went in, the first time we went to Russia was in 1976. And it was in November. I saw the sunshine one time, one day, the entire time we were in Russia, and or it was the Soviet Union then.
Right.
That was back during Brezhnev's time. And it was cold. It was definitely cold.
Cold and dark. I know. It was
Yes.
really cold in December of 19, whenever it was, 2016 when we were there. But anyway, I digress. But going back to our original point, Bess has had such an unusual for a young woman of her class and so forth, being able to go and actually serve in, as a nurse in the battlefields and take care of people and all the rest of it. I just like to see how she kind of settles into whatever it is she's going to do.
I agree with you. And my position is I'm not going to give up on her yet.
Good. Well, we can talk. We can collaborate. If we absolutely have to, we will collaborate. That'll work out well. I have other thoughts on that subject. So anyway, 13th Bess. And then with luck, we will see Rutledge sometime this year or early next year.
If everything goes, generally it takes a year from the time you turn it in to the time that it's a book on the shelf.
And he normally came out in February. I mean, for years, he kind of
Yes.
showed up in February. So February of 2024 would not be unreasonable.
Unfortunately, due to paper publishing, you know more about this than I do. It's been very difficult to get books published, but the good thing that I understand is people still love the written page.
Absolutely. I have to tell you, the book sales keep going up. I mean, I've really been astonished at how people are still flocking to, to printed books, coming to events. As you know, we stream all our live events, and the size of the audience is just amazing. We spoiled our local customers because we've had a really rough winter for Phoenix. I mean, it's pitiful compared to other places. It's actually been like 40 and had rain, so
Yeah.
Phoenix rough is not really rough. But I was so amused that after we had an event, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, we had a nice turnout and the whole bit, but it wasn't because it was a horrible night. It was raining and it was miserable and the whole bit. And the next day there was a couple in the store picking up their book and they looked at me and they said, we really meant to come, but it was cold, so we just put on our jammies, curled up, so we could watch it instead. Because you can watch them on your smart TV. You don't have to sit
Right.
in front of a computer.
Then I live in Southeast Florida.
Right.
So yes, it actually dipped down to about 42.
I know. And we're all in fur coats, right?
Absolutely. You go outside, people are walking their dogs and they've got earmuffs and parkers and gloves.
And then the tourists are wearing flip-flops and shorts.
Absolutely.
Really
You can always tell the
distinguished.
tourists.
It is indeed. So
They're out on the beach wearing their swimsuits and the rest of us are huddled up with our parkas on.
It was like in the low 40s yesterday, and one of the authors who was with us last night wrote me an outrage and said, there are people in the pool, she said, they're just like popsicles. She was huddled inside. It was so funny. Anyway, Patrick, come join us. We've lost the thread here, so you can add to this discussion.
No problem. Let's see here. There we go. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, it is actually really chilly outside. I just ran downstairs and it's chilly.
Yep.
For us anyway, as you say. Balmy for the rest of the country, I'm sure.
It's currently 81 degrees.
81 degrees?
Florida?
Yes.
Well,
No,
it's 47 or something here.
yeah,
Well, let me get the latest update.
you're in
It
Florida, right?
is, yeah, southeast Florida, right on
Okay.
the Atlantic Ocean. The current temperature per my smartphone it is 74 degrees.
I'll be darned. Wow. Amazing. Yeah, a lot of the comments that are coming in, people are sharing their stories about your mom, which is really nice. You know, a lot of our customers that, you know, had the chance to meet both of you here at the bookstore over the years, and people are sharing their stories, which is really neat. Yeah, I was lucky enough to have met both of you at the Poison Pen bookstore. Didn't know your work at the time, was there to meet Reese Bowen. I've loved your work ever since. So that's nice.
I think
Reese is a great person as well as author.
Carol and Reese did at least one event together, I think, at the
Oh, yeah.
store.
Yes, I did an event. You were unavoidably detained or something, and Reese filled in and did a magnificent job.
She always does. She's a
It
wonderful.
wasn't the same, but it was close.
Well, actually, you were better off. I was probably traveling somewhere, but anyway, Reese is wonderful. Reese spends part of the year here in Arizona, and we're very lucky to have her for as long as we get to keep her.
Let's see, Kieran, I think, says aloha from Hawaii. You've already talked about this a little bit, but will Bess and Simon ever get together? Please, question mark.
We're not saying.
We never,
Never
I
say
think
never.
Caroline put it best when she said, you know, we've introduced Rutledge to some nice, respectable young ladies, and he never decides to settle with one of them. It's kind of like my son.
But you live long enough to do that. Now, come on.
Absolutely.
That's right. You just were a young bachelor.
It took me a while to get there, but I think I
You did.
finally did a good job.
You do. Absolutely.
Let's see, what else do we have here? Rita says Mary Anna Evans was also there at that event. Yeah, I think I remember this a few years ago. What else do we have here? Okay, Rita would like to know, I wonder what made you decide to do World War I versus World War II. When I think about the two wars and their differences, the series would be so different, but more opportunities for Bess.
Career-wise, it would to a certain extent, although you know, we in the United States, we proudly show the posters of Rosie the Riveter, but as soon as the men came home, that changed. War One was very different, and one of the many reasons we chose England was the devastating loss of pretty much an entire generation of young men in that war. Compared to the United States, their losses were staggering, and it was several things, but let me be concise. Peter Jennings and Tom Brokaw in their books on the 20th century said that World War I was the most pivotal event of the century, and we're still paying the price for decisions that were made during and after that war. The other thing is England really began to change from the Victorian Edwardian eras into becoming the modern Britain that we know today. Yes, the aristocracy survived. It was the only one that survived after that war in any true sense, but they came back. England was in debt. They had taxes going up. People who were inheriting country homes couldn't afford to keep them up. And England lost a lot of its estates and everything. It was a time of tremendous change for that country. And so naturally that, in our view, gave us a lot of opportunities. And the other thing, quite simply, was in 1994, when we were working on a test of wills, nobody was writing about World War One. And the impact of not only the casualties and everything else, but shell shock and what it did to people, and the films that you see now of World War One veterans that just absolutely crumbled under the weight of shell shock. And yet, typically British, they survived. They managed to pull it together and survive and turn around 30 years later and do it all over again. That I have always said, there's nothing against the greatest generation being those that fought in World War II. I'm 100% there. But I look back at my grandfathers who survived World War One, survived the influenza epidemic, survived the Depression, survived World War II, and yet still, if you look at the mark they left, whether it's the interstate highways that Eisenhower brought in, or all the schools and public buildings that that generation was able to produce that lived long after they were gone, is just absolutely amazing to me.
Well,
So
it was a really pivotal time for women. Not only did they, lose an extraordinary number of men, but many women, their whole normal course through life was deflected by the war. They
absolutely.
had to go and do things, learn jobs, and we talked earlier about that they
And some of those men didn't come home and take their old jobs back because they were buried in
yeah.
Belgium and France. And so that really changed the role of women. Plus, they got the right to vote. Plus, right after the war, England changed its voting laws. All of a sudden, more of the common people, non-landowner type, were able to actually participate in elections. And it was a bold step to take for the English government. They didn't know what was going to happen. But the election went through and they managed. They did have MacDonald as the socialist prime minister for a brief while, but they still toughed it through.
And didn't a lot of the men who did survive and come back, they faced pretty grim economic prospects when they returned, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But that was also true after Waterloo, the C.S. Harris series that I love so much, the Sebastian Saint-Cyr. England has never been great to its veterans. It's just, we weren't either. Think about Vietnam. Think about what the people who fought in Vietnam, not voluntarily even, what kind of thing they faced.
Well, if you've ever been to Greenwich, you know that that was originally built as a soldier's home and sailor's home. And eventually it got taken over by the upper crust. And, your average soldier, there is one particular scene, and I'm not going to go into it, but when Bess is driving through York, where we kind of drove that point home, and also in Casualty of War, how all these men came back, but they were no longer able to keep jobs, either physically or mentally.
Anything else, Patrick?
Yeah, there's a question about, I mean, you've talked a little bit about research, but I mean, at this point, you must have like an immense personal library covering this period. Are you still, I mean, but it is endless, you know, are you still finding little kind of little human details that say, ah, you know, we haven't actually written about this particular thing?
Oh, see, that's the one thing Barbara and I were talking briefly before we started about how Caroline was always curious, and she ingrained that in me. I think learning is a lifelong endeavor, whatever type of learning you tend to lean towards. In my case, I started out being interested in things that went boom, and wars and battles and generals and all that. And then as I grew older, I started saying to myself, why? Why were these things happening? And that branched out from there. And then with my mother's background, primarily in English history, but with Caroline, she knew so much. My mother and father both exposed me to books at a very early age. I still have my uh, juvenile library membership card. I When I was 3, they told me I had to sign my name to get a card, and I went home and practiced and practiced and practiced, and came in and was able to sign my name and get my juvenile library card. Boy, I was something. And books are always fascinating to me. Talking to people is always fascinating to me. And also I unfortunately you don't see it that much anymore, but my mother's father was a true storyteller. And I think that more than anything else has shaped both of our lives, because he would sit out on the porch at night and tell stories. And I could tell you that story right now and it wouldn't mean anything. It was the way he told that story, and the certain stories that I would ask him to tell again. Tell me about when the train went across the railroad tracks and the coal fell off the coal cart. Tell me about that. And he would go into it with some variations on the theme. At its heart, writing is telling a story. That's why Caroline and I worked so very hard to make sure that what we put on paper spoke with one voice. You didn't need to be cluttered up with, well, okay, this is chapter 2. All right, this is Charles, and this is this. You needed to tell a story. That's what we were there to do, and that is what I tried to live up to now.
Since you had such a close, obvious relationship over these years, do you find that when you're writing now, you can kind of like hear her feedback, you know, how she would respond to a scene? Is that kind of deeply ingrained in your mind?
It is, and it isn't, because there are many times when, out of natural instinct, I pick up the phone. I'm not sure how we're going to handle this. What do you think? And you don't have that, and you try to make the best decision that you think she would have been happy with. And that's why it's so important to me to complete this work. And, if they come back to me and say no, or no, that's fine. But I will know that I put everything I had into putting out another novel, and I can't go back and say, well, if I'd spent more time, or if I'd done this. I did the very best I could, and I'm pretty pleased with the story.
Well, I'm really delighted to hear that, Charles. It's a big undertaking, but it's also a way of working through grief. So
It's
I'm sure it'll be very
therapeutic.
good
It
for you.
definitely is therapeutic.
I bet. All right. Anything else, Patrick?
I don't think so. I think we've covered just about everything
All right.
here.
Well, Charles, it's been a real
Yeah.
pleasure to spend another hour with you. I saw you in
Absolutely.
October in the flesh, but we'll stay in touch, see how Rutledge and Bess are coming along, and get you back out here one way or another.
Well, we're going to San Diego for BoucherCon.
Oh, good. Well, I will be there, so we'll get a chance to see you there.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Both of you all take care.
Thank you very much. Don't forget, we still
Yeah.
have some autographed copies of The Cliff's Edge. I don't know, Patrick, do we have any other earlier books by the
Yeah.
Todds?
Yeah, we do.
We
have-
probably do because they visit us regularly with all of their books. So if you're
5 or 6,
interested,
I think.
huh?
I think we have at least 4 or 5 earlier titles. Yeah.
Great, wonderful. Anyway,
I think what was it, 98 when I came out the first time?
boy, I don't remember exactly. It
had a
wasn't
big
for
beard,
Jester
I remember.
Wills. Was it a leap year? Okay. Well, anyway, we have a long history together. That's for sure.
Absolutely. And
So,
you and Patrick take care, and thank you very much for having me.
It's our pleasure.
so much.
See you soon. Stay in touch. Good night,
Good night,
everybody.
everybody.
Thanks for joining us.